So, I've recently beaten Atelier Yumia in a span of 80 hours, and despite the gripes that I have with this game, I kinda enjoy playing this game to some extent, to be completely honest. However, I found out that some people do not see Atelier Yumia as an Atelier game, and some people dare say that Atelier Ryza, the game that made the Atelier series somewhat famous, is not an Atelier game. When I read those statements, it really give me flashbacks of people saying that Final Fantasy 15 and 16 not being a Final Fantasy game, simply because they're different compared to older Final Fantasy games like Final Fantasy 7 and Final Fantasy 8. Which brings the question, what defines an Atelier game? Does the synthesis mechanic have to involve a big ass cauldron? Or does the combat have to be turn-based and not real-time? With that being said, I'm gonna watch this video by Gaming Backlog that talks about the evolution of the Atelier series, and I'm gonna approach this video with the perspective of someone who plays RPG on a casual basis and have little to no knowledge on what an Atelier game is all about.
The Atelier series is one of the longest ongoing franchises in video game history, with over 27 main games. We've seen a lot of
27
franchises
main
stand
games?
up to the test
Wow.
of time and continue to share with us many of their titles. And the coming of Atelier Yumia continues to cement that forward momentum. But because a franchise has existed for so long, visions sometimes change, whether it's a reflection of the times or the need to shake things up. With Atelier Yumia changing up its turn-based combat format for action, it makes you think about the franchises that made the shift and those who stuck to a tried and tested format. Welcome to Gaming Backlog. I'm Bina, and let's talk about that. The Atelier series was developed by Gus Corporation, a division of Koei Tecmo. Its first game dates all the way back in 1997, Atelier Marie, The Alchemist of Salzburg, and started
1997,
distributing internationally with Atelier Iris, Eternal Mana. Eventually, it was Atelier Ryza and the Secret series that brought the franchise into a whole new level of popularity, Ryza becoming one of the most sold games of the franchise. The series consists of
Here's the thing about Atelier Ryza. Atelier Ryza not only made the Atelier series famous, but it also saved the franchise. If Atelier Ryza had been a commercial failure, the entire franchise is gone. Which is one of the reasons Ryza had to be designed in the most attractive way possible. And here's another thing that Hosoi-san mentioned regarding Atelier Ryza. The producer of the Atelier series, Hosoi Junso-san, literally said that the reason why they designed Ryza to have thick thighs is because people in Japan prefer women with voluptuous body in times of economic hardship. Ryza is so iconic to the extent that Benitama, the person who is in charge of designing the characters for Atelier Yumia, felt pressure because they couldn't imagine surpassing Ryza's design at all.
standalone games, with each story centered on a young woman, alchemy, friendship, etc., etc. We discuss it, but we all know you're here for the combat. For the longest time, Atelier always had turn-based combat, a popular style for RPG games. The way it goes is pretty explanatory, we think. Execute an action or two, then your turn ends.
So basically, throughout the entire history of the Atelier series, it's been a turn-based combat, okay? And here's another thing I want to highlight. The only Atelier's games that I've played so far are Atelier Ryza 1, Ryza 2, Ryza 3, and recently Atelier Yumia. Before that, I've never played any of the Atelier games before, which includes Atelier Marie, Atelier Sophie, I believe. The one there's also another popular one, and then the Atelier game that Gus decided to ship internationally, which is Atelier Iris, I believe. But still, at least I know that. So throughout the entire history of Atelier games, all this while they've been doing their combat is basically turn-based RPG, which is essentially the same as how the old school Final Fantasy games are, which are FF7, FF8, and FF9. And FF13 is still kinda turn-based-ish up until 15, where they decided to change the combat to a more action-oriented combat.
Rinse and repeat. All the older games were turn-based, but when Ryza came along, it adapted an active time battle system for the first time. With active time battle, elements of the original turn-based were retained, albeit implemented with a time bar that instills a little bit of urgency. So even with the slight changes, people could still argue that it stayed true to the formula of the earlier titles.
Yeah, because Atelier Ryza 1 is still technically a turn-based game. Although it's a little bit different, but people can still call Atelier Ryza 1 a turn-based game. And then when they come into Ryza 2, the battle has slowly shifted to a more action-oriented game, with literally bits of turn-based elements in it.
What people love about turn-based combat is that it allows you to take your time strategizing your moves. It's more like chess than suddenly being put into a football field and you have the ball with a bunch of athletes gunning for you. Turn-based players love that they can really optimize their battle plan as much as they can, maximizing whatever move or ability is in their arsenal. Some players find this certain combat style a comfort of sorts, something accessible to those who can easily get overwhelmed or just don't feel like action is their thing. But here comes Atelier Yumia. Yumia now uses real-time combat, keeping players on their feet. Versus ample time to plan, you're thrust into the thick of it with nothing but your instincts in making quick decisions, and practice the more you play. Also, if you want to know more about what we think about the game, check out our video all about Atelier Yumia. Action gameplay can sometimes be overstimulating. At least I know it can be personally. There can be a lot going on that it can be hard to absorb what is going on.
So long story short, right, because of the fact that Atelier Yumia has taken the approach of being a more action-oriented, just like how Final Fantasy did it with Final Fantasy 15, people who have a history of playing Atelier games are not used to the more action or to the combat of Atelier Yumia, simply because throughout the entire history of the Atelier series game, it's turn-based. So asking older veteran Atelier players who are so used to playing turn-based games, jumping right into a more action-oriented game, which is Atelier Yumia, is going to be difficult for some players. I personally have no issues playing such games because I am so used to playing both turn-based games and action-oriented games, because I do have a history of playing older Final Fantasy games, such as the likes of Final Fantasy 7 and Final Fantasy 8, and a more action-oriented games, which is Final Fantasy 15. So I can understand that some people are not used to the combat of Atelier Yumia, but the reason why Atelier Yumia take this approach of changing the combat is simply because they are trying to appeal to the more modern audience. That's how I see it. Continuing.
Let alone try to figure out your next move all in a split second. If we consider the fact that Yumia is having its international release, it being an action game might make the game more accessible. Action combat mechanics can be very instinctive, and it might allow players to just get into things versus in a turn-based format where you need to learn the mechanics more thoroughly. In a way, perhaps it's a way to spread the word on the series to hopefully grow its community more, and will then lead new fans to the older games. But of course, these thoughts are very much just our own ideas on the changes. What do the people over at Gust actually feel about it? In an interview with Noisy Pixel, producer Junzo Hosoi addressed the shift. Atelier traditionally leans toward turn-based RPG systems, so finding the right balance between real-time action and strategic depth was definitely a challenge. We arrived at a system that retained the RPG core while offering more immediate skill-based interaction. He also addressed in an interview with 4Gamer that the team did their best to design combat to be fun and intuitive, to have a bridge between players who love action games and others who aren't experienced in them. And it's not like the rest of the Atelier series will stick to this forever. Hosoi mentioned that the Atelier series will continue to explore both turn-based and real action-heavy games.
Okay, so like I said, they're definitely trying to appeal to the modern audience by making Atelier Yumia a more action-oriented game. And as a matter of fact, right, Gus has pretty much enough manpower to make 2 Atelier games at the same year. So what they can do is they can make an Atelier game that is more action-oriented to appeal the modern audience, And at the same year, they can make an Atelier game that is turn-based that appeals to the old school Atelier fans.
So long as it fits the project they are working on. They may return to turn-based combat or continue with this entirely new style. And not to mention, the Atelier Marie remake that was released back in 2023, which retained the turn-based style, received very positive acclaim on Steam.
So that means that people still want turn-based RPG games. As a matter of fact, right, another turn-based RPG game that was recently released, which is called Clear Observance Expedition 33, it is well received in terms of sales and it is well received in terms of reviews. And that game is also a turn-based RPG, but more interactive. So, long story short, there are people out there who demands for turn-based RPG. So, which is what like I say that what Gus could do is they could make 2 games within the same year, or they could just what you can do is within the first year they just release a more action oriented Atelier game, and then in the second year they go back to making a turn-based Atelier game.
I think it's fairly common for games, especially those belonging to long-standing franchises, to try and shake things up. We've seen franchises like Yakuza going the opposite route. Its mainline game is famously known for its action
is also another
switch things
example.
up by going the turn-based route along with their main character change.
Yakuza, even Yakuza is also another example of they are changing the combat, where Yakuza originally was an more action-oriented RPG from Yakuza 0 till Yakuza 6. And then comes in Yakuza 0, they decided to change the combat to a more turn-based oriented. And guess what? People enjoyed the game. People enjoy a turn-based or a more turn-based oriented RPG of a Yakuza game. And as a matter of fact, even Yakuza 8, which is called Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, sold well despite the fact that being a turn-based RPG game.
Success is always a hit or miss when it comes to this sort of shift. But we've seen franchises like Final Fantasy VII, which in itself is already its own kind of franchise, make the big shift in its remakes to critical acclaim. And as a whole, Final Fantasy has been one of the franchises that is completely moving on from its old combat format.
To be fair, the reason why FF7 Rebirth is popular and the success that it had is simply because people demanded an action-oriented FF7 game. They demanded an action-oriented, which is why Rebirth is so successful and is so popular. That's the only reason. Long story short, supply and demand. If people demand for an action-oriented RPG game, they're gonna buy it without a shadow of a doubt. If people still want an Atelier game to be a more turn-based RPG game, they should voice it out on social media or something like that, because that they still want a turn-based RPG game instead of a more action-oriented RPG game like Atelier Yumia.
Especially when you look at their most current title, Final Fantasy XVI. But despite the success of these games, we have to acknowledge that the changes did turn off some people. While some praise the new format, some say that the old system still worked.
And that's the thing. Not many people welcome the changes of an RPG game, which is what happened in Atelier Yumia. Because people are so used to the turn-based combat in an Atelier game, and then they found out that Atelier Yumia turned out to be a more action-oriented game, just like what happened when FF15 turned out to be a more action-oriented an action-oriented game instead of the old school turn-based RPG game, just like FF7 and FF8. There are people that welcome those changes, but of course there are people that criticize those changes. Long story short, you can't just make a game that makes everyone happy. You just can't.
The newer system feels more awkward. For FF16, some say that the combat lacked the challenges promised when they said the combat would be very Devil May Cry leaning, like the game was holding back. Also, we talked about these games before, so if you want more detailed reviews about them, check out our channel. On the other hand, there are modern titles that keep to the turn-based combat and find ways
Yeah,
to make it
Persona.
unique to their own title. Persona as a whole has always been updating and shaking the formula up within the turn-based umbrella, while keeping it fun and dynamic still. You can see the turn-based combat also thriving in Metaphor Refantasio, arguably one of the best games to have come out last year.
And here's the thing about Sega Atlas games. Throughout the entire history of their games, the Persona franchise and their recently and their brand new IP, which is Metaphor of Refantasio, are turn-based RPG games. And guess what? People still buy those games. And as a matter of fact, right, those games really sold well and reviewed well as a matter of fact. Which is why sometimes it's best that some developers they stick with what they know, because they know damn well that people are going they're going to grab a certain amount of people that enjoys those franchises.
Winning Best Role-Playing Game last year in the Game Awards. Turn-based or action? Does it really matter? Of course it does. As we said before, people have left franchises they once loved because of a shift in direction. It's happened more times than we can enumerate. A sudden shift in combat can be a huge turn-off to players.
Yeah, that's the thing. Because people in general, when they think of Final Fantasy, they think of turn-based back then. When they think of Persona, they think of turn-based. When they think of an Atelier game, they think of turn-based game. But when you decided to make a new game and decided to change the combat from turn-based to action-oriented, the possibility of turning people off is there. Simply because their image of seeing that franchise as a turn-based game has been demolished. Which is why some people were upset over the fact that this is supposed to be a turn-based franchise. Why the sudden shift to a more action-oriented game? And the reason is simply because back then, action-oriented games were more demanded compared to turn-based RPG game. Up until the release of Baldur's Gate 3, which was 2 years ago, and Metaphor Fantasy, which was last year. And ever since then, the demand for turn-based RPG games has slowly increasing.
Especially with a series that's done the same thing for the longest time, having a big change is like being splashed with ice-cold water. Why fix something that isn't broken in a sense? Some franchises' combat is sometimes the signature of the series itself. So when something pretty huge
Didn't expect to
changes,
see Resident
it can
Evil
really shake what
in
makes the
this
series
video.
a staple in the first place. However, in the end, people have their preferences and biases. A well-established franchise changing its format on anything, from the combat to art style to storytelling, can always be a bit of a gamble. But sometimes, if you're lucky, changing things up can lead to different discoveries on how much the game can grow.
Which was what happened since she brought up Resident Evil, right? Originally, Resident Evil is a fixed camera game, which is in Resident Evil 1, Resident Evil 2, and Resident Evil 3. Then, in Resident Evil 4, they decided to discard the fixed camera angle and the tank controls, and decided to change the camera angle to a more shoulder a third person shoulder length camera angle. And the gameplay is they decided to shift to a more action oriented game. It's a risk that Kamiya no I'm sorry not Kamiya it's a risk that Mikami took back in the early 2000s, but because the game was so popular, there were a lot of games that took references from the OG Resident Evil 4 game, which is why sometimes change can be a good thing if done right. And as a matter of fact, right, even though Resident Evil 4, they shifted to a more action-oriented game, it still retains the survival horror elements of Resident Evil, which is why to this day, Resident Evil 4 is still one of the most, or should I say, one of the best Resident Evil game of all time.
See where hidden potentials in the formulae can lie. If you're even luckier, you could even get an older fan into a different genre of games that they never knew they would like. It is still, of course, a gamble, and public reception is pretty important if the attempt is a hit or miss. If Atelier Yumia makes its new take in gameplay fresh and most importantly fun, I think that would be a win in itself. And like Hosoy said, it doesn't mean that this is the end for turn-based combat. What if they make remakes of their old games? What if Gus finds a way to perfectly amalgamate turn-based and action together? Like alchemy? Yeah? The best way.
Okay, so what they could have done for Atelier Yumia is that they could have done the same thing in terms of combat for just like how Atelier Ryza did, where they mix a combination of more action-oriented with a little bit of turn-based. I get it. It's kind of difficult for them to do that, but if done right, they could appeal to the more modern audiences while appealing the old school Atelier fans at the same freaking time. Unfortunately, that's not the case because what Gus did for Atelier Yumia is that they decided to go full action-oriented combat for Atelier Yumia, which is why some people out there, they do not acknowledge Atelier Yumia as an Atelier game, because in their brains they see an Atelier game as a turn-based game. And I can understand why some people, they don't acknowledge Atelier Ryza as an Atelier game. As a matter of fact, even though there are Atelier Ryza has some turn-based elements in it, simply because that Atelier Ryza, there's turn-based elements, but there's a combination of turn-based and action in the combat, which is why I understand that why some people, they don't acknowledge Atelier Ryza as an Atelier game.
Way to find out if it works enough is to simply play the game. See for yourself if you're a fan or not. I think it's good that games try to change things up, because either way, they can return to something that worked in the past, or pushing the boundaries leads to a big eureka moment. Thank you for watching this episode of Gaming Backlog. What do you think of established franchises changing up their formula? Do you have instances where you liked it, disliked it? Tell us in the comments. If you want to follow more
Okay, so here's another thing that I will say this. I personally don't mind the combat of Atelier Yumia, but the thing about Atelier Yumia is that I kind of wish that they release that demo 1 month or 2 months before they release the game. Because my biggest gripe with Atelier Yumia so far is that it's poorly optimized. It's poorly optimized to the extent that there's way too many moments where the game literally crashed. Like a lot of times. Especially when I'm trying to teleport from one place to another. Which is why I really wish that Gus release the demo 1 month or 2 so that they can use the remaining time to optimize the game so that people will have very good first impression of Atelier Yumia. Because any game that release launch, the first impression matters the most. And here's another thing that I have to get off my chest. Despite the success that Atelier Ryza that has saved the franchise, unfortunately, the Atelier series in general is still relatively niche. Which is why I hope what Gus can do is that they will release an Atelier game where not only they can appeal to the modern audience, but they can also appeal to the hardcore fans of Atelier series as well. And I really hope that they can do something about the combat where they can mix a good balance of turn-based and real-time action. I'm gonna give this video a thumbs up, and I kindly suggest you all do the same as well, as these kind of videos, they are valuable for those who have no idea what the series is all about. And as a matter of fact, I kinda wanna check out the very first Atelier game, which is Atelier Marie, but I won't jump right into the game as there are other games that is higher on my priority list. Anyway, I'll be back. I'll let you guys know when I'll be checking out Atelier Marie. And don't forget to check out my playthrough of Atelier Ryza and Atelier Yumia as well. The playlist will be at the end of the video. Appreciate the likes and comments down below. Thank you guys for watching. My name is AJ, and I will see you all next time.